What's going on, guys? In this video I'd like to start a new series where I answer some of your questions. I figured a Q&A segment where you get to know me a bit better was a great way to do that. The more you know about my experiences, the easier it is to understand why I have the opinions I do on the games I cover. Last year I had planned for an episode similar to this, so I'll start by pulling questions from that community post I made some time ago. I'm gonna do this in scripted format so I can stay on point and not ramble on for hours. I chose 10 questions to get us started, so let's get right to it. Our first question comes from Batpaste, and they want to know about worst stories of the import scene back in the day. Well, importing in the early 90s was definitely the Wild West in a lot of ways. Unless you had an import shop in the town you lived in, most of the stuff you bought was a complete shot in the dark. This was before the internet, so there were no trailers, no emulators to try them out on, no demos. So the worst stories were when you dropped mad bank on games that ended up not being worth it at all. I can regale you with great stories like importing a Japanese Sega Saturn at launch, but there are just as many stories where I purchased something thinking it'd be great, only to end up with something I hated. Importing games wasn't cheap. Japanese games were often a bit more expensive than US games in general, but then import stores would apply a premium, and then you had to pay shipping. This meant that often new releases were $60 to $80 from the get-go, and then another $10 to $20 shipping. So we are talking upwards of $100 just to get a game by mail order. I loved having Strider a few months early, and the premium was worth it. But dropping 80 beans on something like Rostan Saga 2 was a huge waste of money. I loved every minute of Panzer Dragoon and Astal, but I turned around and spent $100 to get Daedalus, aka Robotica, right after that, which was a huge waste of money too. And that was the yin and yang of early import gaming. You flew by the seat of your pants, and sometimes it worked out and sometimes it left you with some crazy buyer's remorse. Buying games tended to be like that whether they were imports or not, but the added costs definitely made the pill quite a bit more bitter to swallow. To make matters worse, selling your import software and hardware back to those retailers usually meant a massive loss in value. You think GameStop pisses on you today? Back then you were looking at some places offering you 25% of what you had paid for them. Christian wants to know, did I have a PlayStation when it originally came out? Yeah, I was a huge fan of the original PlayStation. At first I wasn't interested in the platform, but after seeing previews for NFL Game Day and Warhawk, I was really curious to see what else it could do. Sony had also scored the exclusive rights to Mortal Kombat 3, which I was really looking forward to, and Sony had Namco games you couldn't get anywhere else. I was also fortunate enough to have a best friend that shared the burden of buying games with. We would often buy games strategically so we could cover more ground and experience a wider range of software. This allowed us to play pretty much everything we wanted on the Saturn and PlayStation. If one bought Mortal Kombat 3, the other one bought Tekken. One Doom, the other Destruction Derby. While I always preferred my Saturn, the PlayStation offered me a huge amount of software to dabble in, and then a huge amount of great games I'm glad I never missed. My gaming journey wouldn't have been the same without it. David wants to know, will Sega launch a new console? I actually get this question a lot, and I mean a lot. And the answer is absolutely not. At least not anything nearing the level of the PlayStation or Xbox line. The Sega of today is about making software for specific markets. They are much more frugal with their investments and business decisions. To launch a competitive console today, Sega would need to invest an incredible amount of money and then court third parties to make games for them. All this while Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo provide nearly insurmountable competition. The Sega of today also has zero connection to the Sega of the 80s and 90s. There is no old guard management remaining, chomping at the bit to get back into the fight. Sega's new management doesn't give a rat's ass that there was a Master System, Genesis, Saturn, and Dreamcast 20 plus years ago. We may see some compilations and classic console releases in the future, but as far as a full-fledged platform like the Sega of old, there's not a chance in hell. Jeff wants to know, tell us one thing about Sega Lord X that most people don't know. It actually took me a while to think about this one, and I came up with something I believe most of you will appreciate. Handheld gaming was a big part of my entertainment growing up. I enjoyed the Game Gear, Game Boy, and Lynx immensely. Heck, some portable games were damn near as good as their console big brothers. But it was actually Sony's PSP that really brought me what I had always been wanting in a portable device. It had superb graphics, and once it was hacked, could run a bunch of old school emulators. People don't realize it, but it was also a great device for Sega games. Sega supported the PSP with numerous titles new and old. Being able to play Outrun 2 on the go was priceless. Sega Rally, Afterburner, Sonic, Phantasy Star. There were dozens and dozens of Sega published options on there. To this day I still play it, still use it, and still consider it my favorite handheld gaming device of all time. JJ wants to know, you get to choose one HD remaster from Sega's entire library. What game would you pick? Before I begin, it's important to point out that a remaster is not a sequel or a remake. A remaster is essentially taking the original game and just improving the technical aspects of it, like the resolution and performance. This is actually a tough question because there are so many I'd love to see. I mean the arcade Virtua Fighter 4, Outrunners, Shining Force 3, Panzer Dragoon Saga, just so many games I want to see on modern systems with improved visuals and sound. Power Slave would have been high on this list, but it actually received an official update not that long ago. But when I really think about it, I would really love to see someone take Dragon Force 1 and 2 and make an updated Dragon Force collection. Widescreen presentation, high resolution assets, maybe some new AI profiles to adjust the difficulty a bit. I think something like that would sell incredibly well, particularly if it were priced reasonably. Since these games have been stuck on machines that are 20 plus years old now, it'd be nice to have a new generation give them a go. Silver Axe 13 asks, which long dormant Sega IP do you believe would have the most success if a new entry was released? Now this differs from our remaster question quite a bit because in this instance, we are talking an actual sequel or completely new entry into a classic Sega franchise. An example of this would be something like Sonic Mania or Streets of Rage 4. After giving it some thought, I think Sega would do well with a sequel to Shinobi. 3D action games are more popular now than ever, and if they had the right partner, bringing Shinobi into the 3D realm shouldn't be difficult at all. Shinobi showed up in 3D on the PlayStation 2, and while that was exceptionally limited compared to modern games, I believe that blueprint would still work today. It would be especially nice if the game setup was done similar to the Game Gear releases, where you had to defeat areas, rescue other ninja, and gain their expertise in various ninja art forms and weapons. Areas could be replayable, stats could be improved through a leveling system, and there could be hidden boss battles, weapons, costumes, and other content strewn about to discover. Perhaps one of the unlockable ninja could be throwbacks to older games, like a robotic cyber shinobi you could use. The final area could be loaded with traps, puzzles, and enemies that needed the entire shinobi team to overcome. I think if you deepen the shinobi lore with a good story, give the gameplay a nice upgrade, and throw in lots of fan service, this series has more than enough to make it a premier modern title that could sell well. Daniel wants to know, how much do you think your entire collection is worth? I honestly don't know. I have not sat down and priced out anything in a very long time. My collection is also much smaller than it was 15 years ago, but I still have some heavy hitters. There are about 20 titles in my collection that would immediately shoot the worth into the tens of thousands of dollars. Add in the hardware I own, the many games that are $50 to $100 plus in value, and all the accessories, I could probably ballpark its value in the $30,000 to $40,000 range. The Saturn games would account for 20 to 30% of my total collection's worth, maybe even more. I own 500 or 600 Japanese Saturn games, many of which are highly collectible and worth quite a bit individually. But my collection is far from huge. Hell, compared to most of the bigger collectors on YouTube, I'm probably on the low end. I haven't seriously collected in a decade or more, so what I do own, I have been content with for a very long time. And with pricing the way it is these days, I wouldn't dare pay what I need to get the more rare titles I don't currently own. That ship sailed many years ago, and I can live with what I've got. Garth Vader, great name by the way, wants to know, was there ever a point that you acknowledged arcade cabinets had finally been surpassed by home consoles and thus felt the need not to frequent arcades? Yes, definitely. That would be around the release of the original Xbox, and it was a combination of things really. New arcade games were increasingly based on existing console and PC technology, so the days of cutting-edge proprietary boards like the Model 3 were pretty much over. There was also a huge decline in arcade games that held my attention. Game developers were fully invested in console and PC development at that point, so actually finding a standout title in the arcade was getting pretty difficult. Finally, just the action of finding a physical arcade in my area had become a chore. Most of the real arcade businesses had long since gone away, and what was left were shifting over to ticket centers that were filled with stuff I didn't want to play. There was always a magic and charm a good arcade game could create that you could never get at home, but the market had changed so much by the early 2000s, it just didn't feel the same anymore. Tom says, what is the most excited you've ever been to beat a game? That's a tough one. There was always a raw excitement to beating a game you spent a lot of time with. Finally seeing Mike Tyson go down in Punch-Out was an adrenaline-filled explosion of joy. Watching the Tyrant explode in a shower of body parts made the trip in Resident Evil so worth it. Watching the sunlight burn down what was left of Dracula in Super Castlevania IV was a sight to behold. But I think one of my most excited defeats was Revenge of Shinobi. The first time I beat it, I got the bad ending, losing the girl in the giant trap. And I kept getting that ending for a while because I just couldn't find a strategy that worked. Time after time, that long-haired bastard would keep me busy enough to lose her every time. I eventually figured out that it's what you found in the level before that fight that made all the difference in the world. If I carried over my powered-up attacks and extra ninja magic, I could keep the heat on him fast enough to save the girl. That first time is a memory of pure elation. To finally see that dude explode and that lock drop off the door as Shinobi embraced his woman was an emotional joyride. Nobody had told me how to do it. Nobody had shown me how to do it. It was earned through my own blood, sweat, and tears, and it was glorious. Our final question is, if M2 did another big Sega 3D port for consoles similar to Virtua Racing, what would I like to see next? As you guys know, M2 redid Virtua Racing for the Sega Ages line on the Nintendo Switch. It was a huge upgrade and nicely brought that old game into the modern era. I think Sega would have been smart to do the same thing with Virtua Fighter, though the lack of that game's popularity in the West likely meant it wouldn't have sold the numbers that interested Sega's current management. So if I had to choose an M2 modern makeover for a Sega IP that would appeal to most folks today, it would be Daytona USA 2. Take all of the content from the various arcade releases, get it running in widescreen and a modern resolution, and I think you have a winner. Even if Sega needed to drop the Daytona license, I'd take it under a different name. I mean, would anybody be opposed to something like Sega Racing Megamix? It's never been brought home before, and I think the buzz it would generate if it were released on every console would be huge. Even better if M2 went the extra mile and added the tracks and cars from the first Daytona, maybe the cars from Indy 500 and Sega Rally, and then some secrets like the horse, and you have yourself a modern Sega classic. If it had online multiplayer, I think every person I know that still plays games would buy it on day one. I hope you guys enjoyed this Q&A session. I wanted to do it a bit different than what you normally see on the channel, and I'd like to do more in the future. Hit me down in the comments with your questions and maybe you'll get a spot on a future episode. I'd also like to get your feedback on the presentation here. I really wanted the Q&A to be meaningful and hold some value instead of me just saying a few words without a lot of context. Taking a moment and really considering the question allowed me to give you an answer that was worth hearing. Let me know if you agree. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.